So this week is not part of a sermon series. This week we celebrate All Saints. All Saints is one of those glorious moments of grief and hope. It's worth a standalone worship event. Today we will both acknowledge the gaps left behind by those we have loved and lost, but also celebrate the promise of eternity and that those no longer with us in body are still part of the foundation of our faith. Today's reading is a very famous story from the Bible, where Jesus brings the dead back to life, where Jesus conquers death. There's a lot of emotion packed into today's verses, both from the family of the departed and from Jesus himself. It opens with an emotion that many of us have faced when confronted with loss. Mary says to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her sister Martha said the same thing to Jesus just a few verses earlier. It's easy to read the statement as very accusatory. Where were you, Jesus? Why didn't you save our brother? Why didn't you come when we asked? There's definitely a layer of complaint in the words that she speaks to Jesus, but there's also a reaffirmation of faith. They both fully believe that Jesus could have healed Lazarus if only he had been there. They don't understand why he hadn't come sooner. Earlier in the chapter, Jesus gets a message from them telling him that Lazarus is sick and asking Jesus to come heal him. Jesus intentionally didn't come right when he was asked, though, for reasons that we'll see later. There was a greater purpose behind how Jesus handles the situation that both the sisters don't understand yet. We often ask similar questions when we experience loss. Why did God allow this thing to happen? Like the sisters, we often don't comprehend what purpose God might have. I don't want to downplay the hurt or the loss that we feel when we lose someone close to us. Those emotions are very real, and we should feel them. I'm not trying to say that all bad things happen for a reason, but God is good. And God can make use of even the bad situations, like he did with Joseph and Moses. Feel the pain, but don't close your eyes to how God might be at work as well. Don't allow the pain to undermine your faith. On November 21st of 2012, my grandfather passed away. A few months before, he had fallen in their kitchen and had hit his head on the refrigerator and broke his neck. My grandfather was one tough son of a gun. Not only did it not kill him breaking his neck, but with a few months of rehab and physical therapy, he was well on his way to coming back home. He was likely going to be coming home very shortly, but then he caught a pneumonia. The pneumonia did him in. I couldn't understand how he could have made it through everything else and then, just as he was about to come back home, be taken away from us like that. I still don't understand. I was confused and hurting, and it still does hurt, but I still have faith. Mary still had faith. She falls at Jesus' feet. She wholeheartedly believes that Jesus could have healed Lazarus if only he had been there. She has faith, but it's a questioning faith. When we face those times, we have to remember to take those questions to God. In the verses with Martha, just a little bit before today's reading, we see that Martha doesn't understand why Jesus let this terrible thing happen, but she holds fast to her faith in Jesus, saying, "Even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus reassures her, saying that her brother will rise again. She misunderstands, though, and thinks that he is just talking about the resurrection. In what are potentially the most important lines in chapter 11, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Martha still doesn't completely understand what Jesus is saying until later, though. After he speaks to Mary, we see an emotional Jesus. The words greatly disturbed and deeply moved don't capture the full range of emotion for the original word that was used, though. It's not just upset, but it also means angry or outraged. He's not just upset because of his empathy for the sisters and the grief and pain that they're going through, but also angry at sin, sickness, and death in this fallen world, and all the havoc and sorrow that it generates. I still remember in vivid detail when I got the news about my grandfather's death. I was on the phone with my dad and had just walked into my bedroom when he told me. My legs gave out. I collapsed next to my bed. Nearly dropped my phone. I was crying the rest of the phone call. But while I was on the phone, there was also an anger that was building up inside of me. When the call ended, I began punching my bed. I was distraught and needed something to lash out at. Fortunately, it was my mattress that was right in front of me, and it took the brunt of my anger. Many people feel anger when confronted with death. It's one of the 7 stages of grief. While we may have felt it dealing with our own loss, Jesus was angry not for what he was going through, but for what all of humanity had to go through because of death. Jesus may also have been upset because of the intrusion of the Jews into the scene. When he spoke to Martha, the Jews weren't present. When Martha went to get Mary, she asked her privately and told her that Jesus had asked to speak to her. But when the Jews see Mary leaving, they follow her, and it turns what may have been meant to be a private moment, a private chance to perform a miracle for the disciples, the sisters, and Lazarus, a private and personal moment to truly solidify their faith into a public spectacle instead. Lastly, he may have been upset because of the Jews' lack of faith. Maybe all of these things combined cause him to be so agitated and disturbed. Then Jesus began to weep. The word that's used for Jesus' weeping is different from the word that's used for Mary and the Jews weeping. Their weeping would have been closer to loud wailing, while Jesus would be shedding tears. The Jews see his weeping and assume that it's because of his love for Lazarus. He did love Lazarus, but that's not the reason for his tears. Jesus knew that Lazarus was about to be raised, so he wouldn't be weeping over his loss. No, Jesus was weeping for the same reason that he was so moved, disturbed, and angered, because of the bitter cost and power of death in human lives. This may not be how we would think of Jesus in a time like that. Shouldn't he be nothing but loving and compassionate? There was a great quote in my study Bible that really hit me when I read it, and I think it perfectly explains why Jesus is both grief-struck out of compassion as well as outraged over the circumstances. Grief and compassion without outrage shrink to mere sentiment, while outrage without grief hardens into self-righteous, hot-tempered arrogance. After reading that, the description of Jesus' emotions seemed to fit perfectly. Some of the Jews questioned, though, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? This is different from Mary and Martha. They state they know Jesus could have saved Lazarus. They are confident in Jesus and his abilities, just lacking in understanding. The Jews were disbelieving. Couldn't he do this? They wanted a show of Jesus' power. Instead of trying to understand why he didn't do it, they were thinking he couldn't do it. Despite Jesus' words to Martha earlier, she still doesn't expect the resurrection. It's not that she doesn't believe, it's just that she misunderstood what Jesus told her. She points out that there's going to be a stench if they open up the tomb, since it's been 4 days since Lazarus has died. The fact that it's been 4 days is important for a few reasons. Firstly, it was popular Jewish belief at the time that a soul hovered around the body for 3 days after the death, hoping to re-enter the body. After the 3rd day, the soul would leave the body for good. So it being 4 days would leave no doubt to the fact that Lazarus was indeed completely and utterly dead. Secondly, based on the location that Jesus and his disciples were most likely at when they got the news about Lazarus being sick, they were probably a 4-day journey away. Jesus stayed where they were for an additional 2 days after getting the news before he left. With it being a 4-day journey, and Martha mentioning that to Jesus that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, it means Jesus left the day that Lazarus died. This also means that even if he had left right when they got the news, he still would have arrived 2 days after Lazarus had passed. Whether they had left right away or waited, it would have been too late. By choosing to wait that extra 2 days, Jesus made sure that there would be no doubt to the miracle of the resurrection that he performs. Jesus timed his departure and arrival to maximize the impact of what he is about to do. Then we see Jesus pray. His prayer has 3 parts. First, I thank you for having heard me. Jesus begins by thanking the Lord. This also shows that Jesus has already asked for Lazarus, and the fact that he's already asked and it's been given explains why Jesus wasn't in a rush to get there, and why it's unlikely that his weeping was in regards to Lazarus' death. Next, I know that you always hear me. God is always listening and always hears. No matter the prayer, God hears. God always answers too. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes the answer is not yet. Jesus had already asked for Lazarus' life, and he knew that it would be answered, but he still had to wait until the right moment to receive what he had asked for. Sometimes no is the best answer, like when a child keeps asking for more candy, even though they don't realize it. Not giving them what they're asking for may be what's best for them. Lastly, but I have said all this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. Everything that he is praying is for the sake of those watching. Some of you may be thinking, didn't Jesus say that we shouldn't make a big show when we're praying? The difference is that the Pharisees were trying to draw attention to themselves and show how pious they were, while Jesus is trying to draw the entire crowd's focus not to himself, but to the Lord, and to help the crowd see God's power and glory. That is why he ends his prayer the way that he does, by drawing their attention back to the fact that God is the true author of the miracle. What Jesus does, he does because of the authority that God has given him. Jesus then calls Lazarus out of the tomb. When he emerges, Lazarus is still bound in burial cloth. This helps further emphasize the miracle that Jesus has just performed. It reiterates the fact that he was dead and now lives. It also contrasts with Jesus' own resurrection, where the burial cloth is left behind. Lazarus was dependent on Jesus' voice to achieve freedom from death. Lazarus' resurrection is only temporary. He will still die at some point. Jesus, however, arises completely free of death. Jesus defeats death in the future and the present. The power that death has to separate people from God is reduced to nothing by the presence and power of God in Jesus. Jesus' earlier words to Martha show that. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. We remain in the full presence of God during life and after death. Often we're only reminded of this at funerals or Easter, but we need to be reminded at all times that Jesus defeats death. Yes, in those times of loss, it's important and comforting, but the reality of death is that it's with us at all times. When we have faith that Jesus defeats death, we can be free of our fear of death that can hold us back. So just as Jesus said about the burial wrappings on Lazarus, the wrappings that represented death. For our sake, Jesus says to death, "Unbind them and let them go." Amen.